This is only a test.
Hello and welcome to the Uncover Up. I'm one of your co-hosts, Nathan Radke, and joining me today over the computer is Dr. Lee Kuhnla.
Hi, Nathan. Hi, everyone.
So the last episode we did, we said something kind of obvious but kind of important. Nuclear bombs are destructive and nuclear war would be bad.
Yeah, that's right.
It was a hot take. It was a radioactively hot take.
How bad nuclear war is, like how truly impossibly bad it is, was something that I had to learn again. And so, last episode, I think, was an important corrective and a kind of a summation of the kind of stuff that I've been learning over the last 10 years.
And the reason you wanted to do that episode is so that you could do this episode.
Yeah, that's right. This is really a part two.
Yeah, there wasn't all that much conspiracy stuff. There was a little bit, because we can't have any kind of conversation with no conspiracy stuff. But this one is more like overtly about the relationship between the bomb and therefore the Cold War and conspiracy theory.
Exactly.
And there's all sorts of different relationships there, but there's one in particular you want to look at, because we could look at the way that the fear of nuclear annihilation caused everyone to become paranoid, understandably, and also the ideological war between communism and capitalism, all that body snatcher stuff. They're infiltrating your town. Your neighbor could be one of these or one of those.
Most thinking Americans now recognize the fact that our country is at war. A war declared against us by the rulers of international communism. It is called a Cold War because armed forces, although used as a threat, are rarely unleashed, and blood is not spilled in the massive battles that we think of as war. The communists realized that they could not survive the destructive force of an all-out conflict, so they adopt the Cold War tactic. Nevertheless, their objective remains the total conquest of all the earth.
Yeah.
And so it just primed everybody to see patterns and kind of become more conspiratorial in general. But what you want to talk about today are the real conspiracies, the true conspiracies.
Just an example that we've brought up a lot on the show is nuking the moon. Mm-hmm. You know, the American government had a plan to nuke, and you're like,
Project A119.
Why would they do this? You know, what are they thinking? Like how? And so there is a certain kind of logic behind what policymakers at that time were engaging in that really is all founded on the destructive power of the bomb.
A kind of internal logic.
Exactly.
An internal logic for that situation. And the Cold War was based on one big piece of internal reasoning, which was deterrence, or as it's called, mutually assured destruction.
That's right.
That's like the most important thing about the Cold War. It's why it's cold. Both sides have got nukes. Therefore, war becomes unthinkable because it's so unbelievably destructive.
Yeah. What we're really talking about, without any hyperbole, is the end of the world.
Yeah.
And that does weird things to policymakers. If you are in the government and you're charged with prevent the end of the world from happening, then suddenly I feel like a lot more options become available to you that would in other circumstances seem unreasonable, absurd, and not worth pursuing.
Well, when you're planning something, one question people often ask is, okay, but what's the worst case scenario?
Yes, exactly.
And so in this, what's the worst case scenario? The fiery destruction of all life.
Yeah.
Followed by the ice cold destruction of remaining life.
Exactly. And I think it was Ronald Reagan who said, even the winners of a nuclear war lose. Yeah. So there is just no scenario. If you were to fire all your nukes at the other country you wanted to get rid of, and you did it, and you managed it without them even retaliating with one single nuke in response, your population's still going to die, right? Yeah. They're going to die from starvation and from all kinds of other effects, radiation, fallout, whatever, nuclear winter, et cetera, see last episode. And so that's what we're talking about. And then that makes everything kind of, okay, let's try it. Like, let's go ahead and do it.
Well, from that original bit of reasoning of mutually assured destruction, there's all sorts of other philosophical positions that emerge from that. One, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right.
Because you're confronted with this existential threat from this enemy, you're like, we don't have time to worry about like the niceties or the subtleties. If you are against our enemy, then you are our friend.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of Cold War logic that has been catastrophic, contributed to all sorts of real hidden plans.
Yeah.
Because that enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, what are some examples of Cold War conspiracies that were drawn from that logic that went very badly?
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is that 9/11 is a Cold War conspiracy because it is the summation of that kind of logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And here we have the CIA funding the Mujahideen in Afghanistan throughout the 1980s to the tune of $500 million a year, depending on when you look into their funding. It changed from year to year, and giving them weapons and training manuals and money and resources to recruit other people. And then when
at the same time that the nation that they were in was being used as a staging ground for a proxy war with the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths, incredibly large amounts of orphans and destruction.
Yeah. So, for example, the city of Kandahar, the capital, is reduced by 7/8 in that period.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just.
Yeah, between the war with the Soviets and then the civil war that resulted afterwards.
Exactly. So that, though, was followed precisely this logic of, well, the Mujahideen hate the Soviet invaders, so let's fund them.
Yeah, so Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the worst guys ever.
Yeah.
Good guy.
Right. Good guy with quotes around it. Good guy for
useful
the CIA.
guy. Useful guy.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
He, just for those who maybe don't remember that episode, he was
the Butcher of Kabul.
Yes, Butcher of Kabul, who, among other things, would throw acid in women's faces who were not, completely veiled. That's the guy. And he then becomes president or prime minister in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And so
after getting a lot of funding and training from the CIA, not because they thought he was a good guy, but precisely because they thought he was a terrible guy.
Exactly.
And as a terrible guy, he was useful in that secret plan.
Yeah. And of course, Osama bin Laden comes into Afghanistan in, I think it's 85, in order to recruit foreign fighters, that is, other people who are sympathetic with the Mujahideen's cause, kind of essentially seeing it as a holy war. And he is, he is part of that kind of strategy that the CIA is using in order to defeat the Soviets. And of course, then the Soviet Union collapses. The Americans are like, well, job done here. And then you just give it a couple of years, and the ire of, at least especially Al-Qaeda, it wasn't even the Taliban, is then directed at America. This is exactly, I think, an example of what you're talking about. Yeah. But there's so many others. I'm sure you can think of one as well.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, think about the Contras.
Yeah.
In Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Again, you have a Soviet influence in Nicaragua, and then you have this group, the Contras, who are using pretty despicable tactics, violence and torture. But they're against the communists and the Soviets, and so therefore those bad guys become the useful bad guys, and so the enemy is my friend. And that gets us into another real conspiracy, which is the Iran-Contra affair and selling weapons illegally to Iran. And all these other things. We've never done an episode on that.
No, we haven't. I mean, it's kind of tangential to the crack cocaine episode, which is also another conspiracy that's related to precisely just
the enemy
this
of my
example.
enemy is my friend.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's just one tiny example. That isn't even the logic that I think you want to get into.
No, we haven't even started.
We haven't even started, but that's just an example of how that logic, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, draws from the Cold War logic of mutually assured destruction. And ends up with spiraling off into all of these genuine conspiracies.
Yeah.
I'll give you another bit of internal Cold War logic that ended up in causing a bunch of legit conspiracies.
Okay.
The gap fear.
Yes.
Fear of gap.
Gaps, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about one of those, which we've talked about before, the fear of a psychic gap.
Yeah. No, what is, I mean, when we talk about gaps in the Cold War, what's the obvious gap that people point to, just as the example?
It's the missile gap.
Yeah, the missile gap, exactly. Or the bomber gap before that.
Okay, so it's like the 1950s, and one of the new delivery vehicles for nuclear bombs are these missiles. But of course, it matters how many you have, because especially as this is just all ramping up, maybe you don't have enough to take out the entire country. And if you can't take out the entire country, if you can't do that decapitation strike in a nuclear war, you leave yourself vulnerable to retaliation, which means that you might be entirely annihilated, and the enemy you were trying to get rid of, only half of them are annihilated.
Which means they win.
Exactly. So one of the policy questions for Americans in the 50s is, hold on a second, do we have enough missiles? And this also, of course, always becomes part of different people's parochial interests, in the sense of, hey, if I work in the Defense Department, maybe it is useful for me to really emphasize the fact that we don't know if we have enough missiles and maybe we need more. So,
and of course, this is where Eisenhower, on his way out of office during his last speech, was like, guys, before I go, there's something really dangerous that's threatening the very soul of our nation.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Yes.
It's the military-industrial complex. Anyway, Eisenhower out.
Yeah, exactly. Because retrospectively, it turns out that actually a lot of policymakers knew that there was no missile gap, that the Americans had, a 5-to-1 superiority, where they were claiming it was exactly the opposite.
Well, and again, it was sort of complicated and messy. If we go back before the missile gap, we had the bomber gap, because before you could fire missiles into the country with nuclear warheads, you had to fly bombers over with nuclear bombs. And in the late 50s, the Soviets had a parade. And at that parade, dozens and dozens and dozens of new jet bombers flew over. Yeah. And so, of course, the Americans, seeing this footage, were like, oh, no, this is terrifying. They have so many bombers. They cranked up. The Americans cranked up their aircraft production, both in interceptors and in bombers, because of this bomber gap. And then, of course, the CIA, looking at U-2 photographs and things like that, said, wait, hold on. They don't have that many bombers. And, of course, it turned out they just flew the same 3 bombers around and around and around past the camera a bunch of times. But that was an interesting example of the CIA saying, wait, no, I don't think they have that many bombers. But the military-industrial complex responding by saying, maybe they do. Let's not. Right. This is big business.
It is. And again, as cynical as I think they are at that time, at least certain operators are, and I think you're right to look askance at it from our vantage point, when the end of the world is at stake, I really think the whole let's better be cautious.
You got to err on the side of caution.
You really need to worry that maybe you've got the numbers wrong. Maybe they were flying the same 3 bombers, but that doesn't mean they don't have another 150 stacked up somewhere that they're not showing us.
It's better to mistake a stick for a snake than a snake for a stick.
Oh, that's a good point. Exactly.
So that's the gap logic. So now let's take that gap logic into the weird areas. That was the bomber gap and the missile gap. But of course, it got so much stranger than those 2 gaps.
Yes. This one we've talked about before, which is Project Stargate and the affiliate projects that go along with this. Basically, what we're talking about is the United States' interest in weaponizing psychic abilities. And you have Project Stargate, Grill Flame, Sunstreak.
Those are the big ones.
Those are the big ones. This is the Army's Gateway Project. But they're all basically defense initiatives to try in some way to weaponize psychic abilities.
And you can see why, because that would be an amazing weapon. You could spy using astral projection. You could assassinate using telekinesis. And you could do all of this while maintaining that most glorious of things that everybody always wanted during the Cold War.
Plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. So you're absolutely right. I sometimes try and emphasize this with my students about how amazing it would be for an espionage agency to have the ability, actual psychics who could 100% of the time do the things that we, worry, wish, whatever they could, right? So telekinesis, could you move things at a distance? Remote viewing, could you project yourself to, just imagine as a spy, you're sitting at home and you could actually project yourself into the meeting rooms of the Soviets in the Soviet Union, like the Kremlin, the top secret rooms, and you'd be a kind of fly on the wall, a psychic fly there, and you would just be able to get all the info.
Or instead of trying to trick Castro into diving for a very beautiful shell, which was actually filled with explosives, or spraying him with beard defoliant, or having, a machine gun in a movie camera, or all the other things that they legit looked into, just have somebody go, and, like break one of the valves in his heart.
Exactly.
And then he keels over.
And that was basically the premise of, which was based on one of these projects, that film with George Clooney, Men Who Stare at Goats. The reason that they're staring at them is to try and make their hearts explode.
Yeah. And again, one goat did die in that.
Yeah. I mean, goats die.
Yeah, goats do die. None of the puppies did, fortunately.
So this is, again, you look at it from today's perspective, and maybe the fear of the end of the world is as palpable today as it was then.
But also, going back to this Cold War logic, what is the reason why the Americans in particular were so obsessed with weaponizing psychic abilities?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you that story. So basically what happens is there is intelligence that emerges in the United States that the Soviets are working on some kind of psychic research. I even remember as a kid reading some of this stuff and being and sort of, it was like scientific research into psychic abilities, and it seemed to be it was basically describing what was happening in the Soviet Union. And they're like, no, this is like a thing. Like if you breathe at this rate, or if you get your heart rate to be like this, or if you think in the following ways, you can basically affect psychic abilities. And I was mesmerized by that thought. But that was exactly the intelligence that emerges sometime in the 60s in the United States, is that the Soviets are working on this.
Yeah.
Now, why would they be working? Well, why would they be working on it if there isn't anything to it? And then the worry emerges that there might be a psychic gap, right? That if the Soviets get something like this, and if it's real, they've won the Cold War without even firing one nuclear weapon, because they could just show up one day and the president would sign over the entire country because he's being psychically manipulated. Or you could just say, look, we know exactly where all the silos are. We know all your codes, and we're actually able to get your missile operators to do what we want. Man. we could get them to blow up the bombs right where they are right now. So you guys have to resign. You have to give up. Surrender is what I was thinking. And so the Americans are like, well, we better get on this. Now, again, even if, like me and Nathan, you're skeptical about the utility or the fact that anything like this might even exist, if you are the one who has to decide about how to protect America from, or all of human civilization from, the end of the world, maybe it's worth just looking into it.
Yeah, you got to
right?
look into
Maybe
it.
It's worth just take a little
Don't
bit
leave any money on the table.
Right? And they have these giant budgets. And what does this actually cost? Like a couple of million to see if psychic ability is real is a drop in the bucket for these agencies, even in the 60s and 70s. And of course, we have a whole episode that outlines what happened, but
our first episode.
It is our first episode. Is that the only time we've talked about it?
Yeah.
Oh, dear. Okay. So maybe we should add a little bit, because not everybody has been listening to us for almost 10 years now, which Nathan and I were shocked when we saw how long we've been doing it.
I had dark hair.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not even going to go down that road. I look just the same as I do now.
Sure. Just like Tintin still.
Okay. So what happens is the CIA actually, and they always do this through kind of back channels. So they approach researchers at the Stanford Research Institute. So this is not a government organization. This is it's affiliated with Stanford, and they get these two physicists, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, who are experimental physicists who are not working on psychic stuff. And they basically task them with trying to figure out whether psychic abilities might be real. And they approach some scientists because, they want actual rigorous science here. They don't want already people who are, I guess, already believers or somehow self-selecting for this. Now, Russell, Targ and Puthoff it turns out I don't know if they were already believers or if they turned themselves into believers, but they get scammed. They get scammed hard by, among others, Uri Geller, who was an Israeli. He's still around, and he was an Israeli psychic who immigrated to the United States and claimed that what is basically like stage magic stuff, like
he could
spoon
bend
bending.
spoons.
Exactly. He could stop watches or make them start again just by staring at them. And he was one of the first experimental subjects that they took in, and he wowed them with his magic tricks, and they became full believers. They then got other people, Ingo Swann, Pat Price. I can't remember the rest of the initial subjects. There was, I think, 7 or 8 of them. And looking back on the experiments, they were basically self-selecting people who believed in it or who were pulling a con. But they got such good evidence out of this, or apparent good experimental evidence out of this, that the CIA went ahead and funded it for another couple of years. Then other organizations took up, the Army got involved, so it was the DIA, the Army, CIA, and others had various projects over the 70s and 80s trying to, as I say, weaponize this ability. It didn't work, and I think it was in 1995, there's a big review, this is all available publicly through the CIA archives, where they did a review of all the information, and they're like, no, there's actually nothing here. If you go beyond what Parg and Puthoff did, and you subject it to more rigorous standards, it goes back to what you would expect from chance. So the CIA and the rest of them were not able to find any evidence of psychic ability, let alone being able to utilize it in some way.
So there's a top secret project, cost millions of dollars.
Yeah.
The life of one goat.
Yes, and a puppy, apparently.
No, 0 puppies.
Oh, okay.
And I often talk to my students about how do you tell the difference between a ridiculous true conspiracy and a ridiculous sounding false conspiracy. And this is part of it. That all is pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
But it becomes less ridiculous internally when you put it into the context of the Cold War and the Cold War logic. And it's actually even sillier than you've described. Because why were the Soviets interested in studying psychic abilities?
So this is a bit... I have done, in the research I've done on this, I haven't been able to conclusively verify this, but this is basically how the story might go. Basically, the CIA it's in the 40s or 50s, is imagining how they could get the KGB, so the Soviet CIA, the KGB, to waste a whole bunch of time and money. And they fake the fact that the CIA does, that they are doing psychic research. So, of course, the Soviets have the exact same thing, that exact same panic in the 50s, and they're like, uh-oh, we better get on to this. And so they start doing it, by which time all the initial people who thought of this plan, if this is indeed how it happened, either retire or are promoted away from this project. Basically, institutionally, the CIA forgets that it was their idea to scam the Soviets, and then they are basically scammed themselves.
Yeah, they ran an article in a French newspaper that the American Navy was using psychics to communicate with deep diving submarines.
Yeah, exactly.
Which then caused I guess it wasn't just one goat because there was also some baby rabbits killed, which caused the Soviets then to do an experiment with a mother rabbit and baby rabbits.
Yes.
And, they put the baby rabbits in the submarine and they kept the mother rabbit on shore. And then at a specific time, they killed all the baby rabbits to see if the mother rabbit would have a psychic link with them.
Yes. Yeah. Again, it's very sad, but it's within the context of this kind of logic where it's like, oh, I see why.
Can't have a gap.
I see what they were thinking.
Yeah.
I get it more when you put it into context of we're actually in a political situation where we're not talking to the other people. They are our enemies, quote unquote. And we have world-ending war technologies that if anybody uses it, everyone's dead.
Yeah, and that gap fear. And of course, it was also the gap fear that contributed to another top secret project, which was MK Ultra.
Yeah.
There, it wasn't the psychic gap; it was the mind control gap.
Yeah,
after the Korean War, when a bunch of pilots who had been captured by the Koreans, the North Koreans, went on film to say capitalism's bad and America is bad,
Yeah.
like a lot of people at the CIA said, oh no, clearly, because capitalism's great and America's great, the North Koreans, and by proxy the Soviets, must have come up with brainwashing techniques. This is the first time when the idea of brainwashing comes out. I mean, another possibility is that these pilots were tortured and threatened with death.
Yeah.
And I would also say things if it meant I could get home to my family again.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
But then they're like, well, we can't have a mind control gap.
Yeah.
And so they launch Bluebird and Artichoke, and then eventually MK Ultra, which was a vast and sweeping and expensive and elaborate and wildly unethical mind control program.
Yeah.
Now we've
Which
already
included Canadian victims as well.
Oh yeah, up in at McGill University. Mm-hmm. Now we don't need to go into the logic of that one, and we've already talked about MK Ultra at length. But I do then want to sort of pivot from the sort of the gap fear to another bit of Cold War logic, which is that the ends justify the means.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, that is exactly what is how this logic unfolds in all of the various bizarre projects that we're looking at, because the end is stopping the death of all life on planet Earth.
Yeah.
Therefore, any means seems to be acceptable.
Yeah,
right?
Because
even medical torture.
What does the ends justify the means mean in just sort of everyday language?
Well, yeah, that if the outcome is good, you can do some bad things to get there.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what you do. If what you're trying to do is right, what you have to do to get to that conclusion is justified. The ends justify the means.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, torture, things that are wildly unethical. Programs, for example, Sea Spray, where you coat the city of San Francisco with a bacteria in order to test to see if it would be an effective weapon.
Yeah.
And I mean, and obviously the bacteria that they used, they thought was harmless, although bright red, so they'd be able to find it and track it. But then a bunch of people got infections, and then one guy died. And when they cut him open, of course, his insides were all bright red. And at no point were the people of San Francisco told, hey, heads up, we're trying something over here.
Yeah.
There were other examples in New York subways where they would have bacteria in light bulbs and drop them on the subway to experiment that way. And all of these are obviously wildly unethical.
Yeah.
You can't experiment on people. Well, you can, obviously, but you're not supposed to experiment on people without their permission or their knowledge or their consent.
Yeah. And this isn't just Nathan and I's opinion. This is international law.
Well,
right? Like,
I mean,
this is the
Nuremberg
codes here.
which is non-binding, though.
Right. Okay. Of course. Yeah. I mean,
the
problem with all of these things.
It's historically binding. It's spiritually binding, but it isn't legislative binding. But again, all of those sort of top secret plans, or the experiments they were doing on orphans and radioactivity, like all of these awful, awful things that were done, were done in the context of complete nuclear annihilation. And so it just sort of gave people carte blanche to just do whatever they wanted to do.
Exactly. Well, let me bring up one that's maybe, I mean, it wasn't great for the cat, but it's a little more lighthearted maybe than the examples that we've given so far. But also,
we've already killed baby bunnies and a goat.
Yes. And maybe it's, as I say, it's not great for the cat, but it is wonderfully, it's one of these wonderful depictions of just how bizarre things had gotten for policymakers in the 60s confronting this, basically impossible situation. So surely this has come up many times just in like passing on the episode. I certainly talk about it all the time.
At parties
when I get invited. But it's referred to as acoustic kitty. So the background here is that the Soviet Union had a pretty relatively robust spy ring in the United States, but the United States did not in the Soviet Union. And that's just partly because of like the way the countries were set up. Like the Soviet Union was not a place where people would immigrate. It was difficult. Russian is not English. English is already a second language to a lot of people around the world. Russian is not. Russia was closed. It was not very welcoming to to people immigrating, and they were often seen, especially from the West, they were seen as spies.
And also had decades already of institutional paranoia.
Yes, and they were way ahead even before the Russian Revolution in kind of spying and meddling in other countries' affairs.
The
like
Cheka.
they were sophisticated in a way that especially America was a bit naive in the early 20th century.
When you get invaded a lot,
yeah,
that institutional paranoia really starts to creep in.
And when you live in Europe too, like Europe has been at each other's throats for the better part of 1,000 years or so.
I blame royal families for a lot of that.
Well, sure, but also the proximity.
The pugs of the human world.
Yes. But also the proximity of all the countries that are quite different from each other. I mean, in North America, what have you got? You've got Canada to the north, you've got the United States and Mexico to the south, and otherwise it's just ocean, right? So there are just fewer people for us to like have wars with, like in terms of, landlocked, again, 1,000 years ago, like no airplanes and stuff like that. Okay, anyway, back to Acoustic Kitty. There is, in a sense, an espionage gap. We're not getting as much intelligence coming into America as the Soviet Unions are through their spy network is coming into the Soviet Union. Now, an unofficial secret in politics, which remains true today, or an open secret, I should say, is that embassies are one of the places that espionage is organized.
Oh, yeah.
From and through.
And
right?
fancy hotels.
Yeah. But it'll be ambassadors or their entourage. They're able, for example, to go through airport security without having any of their stuff checked, right? So you would be able to move documents from one country to another much more safely as a diplomat than, a regular guy.
Now, I forget the exact number, unfortunately, but one of the things that came out in one of the recent JFK file dumps was the absurd degree to which people in American embassies were actually working for the CIA. Like it was a ridiculously high percentage.
Yeah, it was.
And the same thing obviously true of Soviet embassies, obviously.
And of course, what was so embarrassing in that JFK filing was that these were in friendly countries.
Yeah.
Right? This was like
France,
the Americans
Germany,
in France.
England.
Okay. So the Americans don't have many spies in the Soviet Union. The Soviets have spies in America. And so how do you spy on the Soviets? Well, enter Acoustic Kitty. And this is by the James Bond department of the CIA, the Technical Services Division or something.
Yeah,
whatever they're called.
TSS.
These are the guys or the people who come up with the cool gadgets. And they're like, what if we get a cat and get it to do the spying for us?
Yeah, nobody suspects a cat.
Right? And so the idea was they would surgically implant a recording device into the cat. So you have a normal house cat, and you have a battery with a wire that goes to a microphone that would be implanted in the cat's ear. And for all, anybody looking at this cat, it looks like a cat, but it is also a transmission beacon something listening device, okay? And the idea was that this cat would be released somewhere around the Soviet embassy in Washington, and it would, I don't know, luxuriate on the windowsill of the Soviet ambassador while they do all their spy machinations. And then the CIA just, up the street in Arlington is like, haha, now we know what they're doing. So they go through with it. And it depends. So here's a bit of a complication in the story. We have two different versions of how this story goes. And one comes from a guy who left the CIA, was really mad at them, kind of quit and in a fit of pique and was like, screw you guys. And then there's another guy who, got promoted all the way up and was happy with the CIA and ended his career with a nice pension. And they tell two very different stories about both how much it cost and what happened to the cat. So if you listen to the grumpy guy, he's like, this cost $20 million. And the first time it was tried, the cat was run over by a car. And then the second guy's like, it didn't cost nearly that much. And when we realized it didn't work, we reverse engineered it and took all the stuff out. And the cat lived to a ripe old age in the way cats do. I'll leave it to the audience to decide which of those two stories is more realistic. But when this is one of those, I just, as you say, pull out when somebody asks me what I do and then they actually ask a follow-up question. This might be one of those things I go to. I'm like, okay, let me tell you about Acoustic Kitty, this bizarre thing that really did happen. This was an actual thing that they did because they're, worried about nuclear annihilation is really the fundamental logic behind it.
Yeah, but there is a logic there. And this, again, goes back to this idea of how do we tell the real absurd-sounding conspiracies from the false absurd-sounding conspiracies? And it has to do a lot with motivation, which has to do with context. Aside from Flat Earth, what is the single most ridiculous conspiracy that's emerged in the last, say, 10 years? Birds aren't real.
Oh, yeah, of course. Birds aren't real. Yeah.
And that's ridiculous. The idea that birds are actually CIA drones and that they perch on power lines to recharge, and that's why you never see baby pigeons, even though I'm walking knee-deep through baby pigeons all day long in Parkdale. But here's the thing. Did the CIA experiment with using pigeons as drones? Yes. Yes, they did.
Yep.
That was in the JFK files as well.
Yeah.
They did experiment with that. So even something as ridiculous as birds aren't real, it's like you have to say, yeah, that's totally ridiculous. Of course, there was actually a Cold War plan to look into using pigeons as drones, but yes.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, a lot of conspiracies, even the ones that turn out not to be real, have some kind of basis in fact. And often that basis is also in the Cold War, right? And this is, again, why we today, I think, are still mired in a whole bunch of Cold War conspiracies. I think 9/11 ended up, even though it was after the Cold War officially ended, is a legacy of the Cold War.
Yeah.
But I think about also something like, and we've talked about this at length, things like disinformation campaigns like HIV/AIDS was created by the CIA. This was a Soviet attempt to get the Americans to basically be more suspicious of their own security apparatus.
Yeah, that was KGB and Stasi, I believe, that program.
It was, yes, exactly. You're exactly right. And we have a whole episode on that. It's called Operation Infection, or otherwise also Operation Denver, if anybody wants to look it up. And there, the KGB basically suggested that the CIA had generated HIV/AIDS in a lab at Fort Detrick, I think, is usually the place, because it's long suspected to have been a biological weapons research facility. It's certainly a Cold War conspiracy, but I would even suggest that underlying it is still the fear of the bomb in two ways. One is that one of the things that the Soviet Union started to really struggle with, already we talked about the bomber gap and the missile gap. The Soviets didn't have as a robust an economy as the Americans, and the Americans were able to outspend the Soviets year after year. By the time it's the 1980s, this is crippling the Soviet Union. They were just unable to keep up.
And especially because they had been drawn into a war in Afghanistan.
Yes, exactly. Which even the drawing in is potentially is another Cold War conspiracy that we didn't even really talk about, that this was kind of part of a U.S. plot to cause a Vietnam for the Soviets, right? But one of the things here was to try and get Americans to be more suspicious of their own security apparatus, and by extension, maybe also things like the, nuclear proliferation. And if we could somehow, by we, I'm thinking the Soviets, get Americans to be more suspicious, maybe they would rein in some of their spending on these bombs, and then we wouldn't, in the Soviet Union, we wouldn't have to spend as much to keep
and we wouldn't go bankrupt by 1991.
Yeah, exactly. Which of course is what happened for a multitude of reasons. I'm not suggesting that just their military spending was
It was a lot of it.
It was a lot of it, right? And so even things like these disinformation campaigns, it was also in a much cheaper way of fighting against the Americans than building bombs.
Yeah.
Right? Like you could build bombs, but you could also just get people to distrust their own government, to maybe cause divisions within that society so that society becomes consumed with dealing with those divisions. And these are problems we're still living with today.
Yeah,
right?
Probably even more so because of there's so many more ways of getting to people now.
Yeah.
through social
Yeah.
media.
Exactly. Exactly. So these conspiracies don't die. They just keep going. And so we are still saddled with a whole bunch of Cold War conspiracies that were basically concocted in an age that no longer really applies, certainly no longer with like the one great enemy with the bomb. And yet the conspiracies remain. But I also wanted to just ask you about one or two of your favorite totally bizarre Cold War conspiracies that are in some way related to avoiding nuclear war. I mean, I was certainly thinking of nuking the moon as one that you like, but I'm sure you've got some others that you can just ones that that kind of the less well-known ones.
Well, that fear allowed for an awful lot of ridiculous plans to come out. A lot of top secret ridiculous plans.
Yeah.
And this is something we talked about in the last episode. Once we had nuclear weapons, and particularly when we had missile-carried nuclear weapons, the idea of defense kind of disappeared from the equation.
Yeah.
It had always been this sort of dance between offense and defense, and offense and defense. But then once you have ICBMs with nuclear warheads, where's the defense? There is only offense.
Yeah.
And so what that did was it allowed a lot of sort of really ridiculous science to emerge in kind of desperate ways to try to think of some kind of way of preventing the missiles from landing. And so we've got episodes on things like this. There was Nicholas Christophilus who came up with the Christophilus effect, whereas if you irradiate the outer atmosphere, it will basically fry the electronics of anything moving through it. And so then you had, what was
and
it?
So sorry, just to connect the dots, that the idea here being that then if the Soviets were to launch their ICBMs,
would have to go through that barrier,
and they would
and they'd fry,
useless.
and they'd fry out, and they'd just crash to the ground.
They'd just be basically tin cans.
Yeah. So they sent an entire flotilla, like an entire Navy fleet, out into the ocean to fire nukes up into the air and explode them in space.
Yeah.
Which was apparently very pretty. And they also apparently didn't tell almost anybody in that fleet what they were doing because it was so top secret.
Right.
Or, of course, there was the idea of building that enormous particle accelerator underneath the Great Lakes and hollowing out underneath the Great Lakes to build the world's largest hydro plant and then draining the Great Lakes. I mean, this didn't get far in the planning stages. This was like blue skying. But it was still stuff that was entertained by groups like the Jasons and DARPA.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think, Nathan, that's a really important point, that even the stuff that wasn't done was still considered.
It was on the table.
Right?
I mean,
it's on.
What if we had a spray that you could spray somebody with that would cause them to be attacked by bees?
Yeah, exactly.
What if there was some kind of bomb that you could drop over a population that would turn everybody homosexual?
Yeah.
These are things that were considered by DARPA planners.
Yeah, exactly. And again, when we in the future look back on this stuff, it just seems so ridiculous. Like, what in
because
the
it is ridiculous.
World? It really is ridiculous. And we're just like, I have too many examples for this show. We're just choosing some of them, and these are, they're fun ones, but they're not outliers. Like, this was really like what the planners were talking about and what was being, really considered even when it wasn't funded. And it's, I think, quite amazing that actually, this logic of everything could end allowed for so much scope in terms of breaking the law, doing unethical stuff, doing really bizarre stuff. And I mean,
but look at the consequences of all of that we're still
exactly.
dealing with now. I mean, we've talked a lot about Afghanistan because it's such a classic example of blowback. But all of the nonsense that, for example, the American intelligence agencies got up to, which was exposed and should have been exposed. Think about what that did to institutional trust.
Yeah.
And then when you require institutional trust, Like you have spent it. You have spent it on these ridiculous plans. Think about the immense amount of money that was spent on some of these things.
Oh gosh, yeah. And think of what else it could have been spent on.
Think of what else it could have been spent on. And so not only has it created an atmosphere of distrust, of understandable distrust, but it's also created a material situation where massive debts have been like racked up by governments, and infrastructure has been crumbling, and people are paying more for groceries and things. And it's like, if we had not had the Cold War, if we had not had the runaway military industrial complex, like what would things look like now? We would be in so for all of those reasons, if it hadn't been for the Cold War, I don't know if you and I are studying conspiracy theories right now.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. And to really hammer home Nathan's point, which is important, today, my understanding is that merely the upkeep of America's nuclear arsenal costs $50 billion a year. And that's just maintenance. This isn't building new stuff. It's not research. It's none of that stuff. It is just maintaining what already exists. And these are weapons, as I really believe, simply cannot be used, because even if you could, quote unquote, successfully annihilate a country with a first strike and not have any retaliation, you're still going to cause such global environmental damage that your own population is going to suffer.
Well,
so
if you burn a city, that's going to make a lot of soot.
Yeah, and that's just
soot.
$50 million down the $50 billion with a B down the drain every year.
Yeah, in a country where increasingly people are struggling to pay for groceries and gasoline.
That's
going to cause a lot of understandable feelings that like something is wrong here. Something has gone terribly wrong.
And then add to that things like the KGB's disinformation, which is just one example. There's the disinformation around HIV/AIDS. That's destabilizing too, because this is now a domestic population who is getting. This is not obviously coming from the Soviets, right? So this seems to, it was on CBS News in 1987. Dan Rathers is like, hey, maybe the CIA actually created HIV/AIDS.
Well, and again, they had gotten up to some real nonsense.
Exactly.
So it's like, if I saw evidence that they had done that, I would believe it.
Yeah, of course. And if it's on the news, right, and it's Dan Rathers, you're a trusted anchorman of, there's this has got some credibility to it, and this is also going to erode confidence and trust and make you maybe withdraw from institutions and withdraw from engaging in the political system, because it's all rigged anyway.
Yep.
So you're right that the money that it was wasted in these projects, and also the result of them, be it in the human costs in Afghanistan, or in the costs of morale with disinformation campaigns, or just simply the lack of spending on infrastructure that went to the military-industrial complex in ways that could never be redeemed in any kind of war, I think creates a condition in that we are living through today. Again, I don't want to suggest that all of this.
It's contributory.
Exactly. It's a contributory cause. I'm not suggesting
it's not necessary or sufficient,
or even that it is the most important contributory cause. There's lots of other stuff going on.
Yeah.
But the fact that
I think it's a significant one, though.
Well, I think the fact that we wasted 50 years doing this nonsense with, developing such impossible weapons, just such catastrophically dangerous weapons, and then having to engage in all this ridiculous politics to try and contain the technology was an epic waste, and has, I really do think that we're still living with a lot of it today.
Yeah. So my question to you is then,
Yes.
if that hadn't happened, if we hadn't had the Cold War, what would you be studying now?
Look, I'm a political philosophy nerd, so I would have studied something about the way ideas impact political culture. And I came from, before I was studying conspiracies, I was looking, among other things, at things like the impact of religious ideas on political culture. So it would have been something like that, something else. But I don't know, because there's too much, also even in my own personal biography, tied up with the Cold War.
It's what happens when you're from Germany.
Well, Germany in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, there was I come from a country divided by the Cold War, and in one in which, like, I learned about the Berlin Wall before I even heard about communism or knew what any of it meant. And so I can't really imagine myself outside of that history. Like, I would just be a totally different person.
No,
maybe I'd be like on the beach surfing. That's I'd be like, we'd all be way more chill without the Cold War.
It's a nice
okay,
thought.
how about you? What would have happened to Nathan without the Soviets?
Again, it's a difficult question because exactly as you say, so much. One of my earliest memories is being in the living room while Dr. Strangelove was on TV.
Right.
My mom walking by, seeing what was about to happen as the bomber pilot is falling on the bomb, going Yahoo, Yahoo, and she ran into the room to turn it off.
Yeah.
Because I would have been like 5 or 6.
Yeah.
And that's one of my earliest memories.
Yeah.
So it is very difficult to guess what I would have done. Maybe philosophy, maybe metaphysics. Maybe I would have been sitting in like on a beach thinking about the concepts of time and space.
You and I are both on the beach in this
We
alternative
both ended up
future.
on the beach. And instead we ended up in the film on the beach.
Yes, exactly.
Which I highly recommend.
Yeah. Well, exactly, because it is one of these great Cold War worries.
Mm-hmm.
So in this episode, and what we haven't even talked about is what kind of fake conspiracies the paranoia gave rise to. Because, of course, when you are afraid and your culture is afraid, then certain kinds of patterns start to become maybe more meaningful than they might be. And I think that a lot of the untrue conspiracies also have their roots here, which we're not going to get into.
They do, but we're out of time.
Exactly.
So that'll have to wait for another day because
the
Cold War did happen, and so we continue to study conspiracies.
Exactly.